My name is Roxanne Tackett. I'm 41 years old, and I've kept a flower shop on the north side of the square in Kirksville, Missouri, for 16 years. And at my own wedding, with 140 people watching her do it, my mother stood up with a glass in her hand and told the room that not one flower in it had come out of my pocket. She said it warm. Nobody hisses anything in this story. Every hard thing in it arrives in a kind voice at an ordinary volume, and that is the whole reason it took me 11 years to hear one. One hand on the microphone stand, and the other one out toward the room the way you'd brag on somebody, toward the stock and the larkspur and the blue bachelor buttons on all 14 tables, and she said, "I want everybody to look around at what her mother did for her. Not one flower in here came out of her pocket," and the room laughed and clapped, because it sounded like a joke about a florist getting her own flowers free, and because my mother has been the woman who sends flowers in this county for 11 years. I'd cut every stem in that room myself. I'd wired the head table at 3 that morning with my shoes off in the cooler, and I'd paid for every bit of it out of an account I opened when I was 15 years old, with money from washing buckets at a greenhouse. Here's what nobody in that room knew. There was a paper sack under my chair, with 61 photographs in it, and in the inside pocket of my husband's suit coat was a little blue passbook that still said $26,412. I'd known for 11 days. I hadn't told one living soul except the man I'd married 40 minutes before. Welcome back to Porch Stories, where the quiet one whose hands made the kindness finally gets to say whose name was on the card. If you've ever done a thing with your own 2 hands and then stood off to the side while somebody else got thanked for it, stay with me tonight. Tell me in the comments how long that went on in your family before anybody said it out loud. What caught her wasn't anything I found at the bank. It was in my own order book, in my own handwriting. And subscribe so you don't lose the porch. Let me take you back to the middle of May. My shop opens at 9 and I'm in it by 4:30. That's not discipline. It's just that flowers drink at night and a bucket doesn't care what time it is. In May, I've usually got 3 weddings and a prom and whatever the week brings, and the week always brings something. I own a flower shop, which means I'm the one they call on the best day of a family's life and on the worst one, and both times I come in the back door carrying a bucket. That's the whole job. People think it's about being artistic. It isn't. It's about being the person who shows up on the 2 days a family can't do anything for themselves, and knowing which door to use. Rudy Housley buys, fixes, and sells used washers and dryers out of a metal building on Highway 63, and he's the reason I was getting married at 41. He is 46. He delivers, which is the part that tells you who he is. He's in and out of people's basements all day long, and he has never once come home and made fun of anybody's basement. The first thing I ever knew about him was that he carried a little roll of felt pads in his shirt pocket so he could level a machine on somebody's bad floor without charging for it. That's the man. His girl Piper is 14. She was 11 when I met her, and she had a rule then that she'd only talk to me about weather, so we talked about weather for a solid year, and now she's 14, and she talks the whole way through a movie, and I'd rather have that than quiet. She stands in the cooler in July because it's the only cold place in town that's free. She has never called me anything but Roxanne, and she has never once had to. Zoe Tandy has worked for me since she was 17, and she's 19 now. She keeps a running list in the back of the order book of every bride's dog's name, and if that dog is in the wedding, she writes down what it's supposed to wear. She's never once been wrong about a dog, and she's frequently wrong about the time. She calls me Rox, which nobody else on this earth is allowed to do, and she has a way of picking up a 5-gallon bucket in each hand and going up the ramp like she's carrying 2 purses. And there's my grandmother, who I have to put in here early, because you can't understand the rest of it if you don't have her. Levon Brumley kept a cutting garden out at the home place east of town, an acre of it, in rows like a truck patch. Zinnias, snaps, stock, larkspur, 4 kinds of dahlia she kept in the cellar over the winter in a crate of wood shavings. And blue bachelor buttons, which are not worth anything and don't ship and don't last, and which she planted every year because she liked them. She did the church flowers for 41 years, and she did funerals for anybody in the county who asked her, and she never took a nickel for one of them in her life. I was out there in that garden from the time I could walk. She let me cut before she let me sweep, which is backwards, and it's the reason I do this. She had a sentence she used. She'd say it standing at the sink with the stems in her hand and her back to you, and she said it the way people say grace, like it was settled a long time ago, and like it was still somebody's turn. Somebody in this family has to be the one who sends flowers. Hold on to that one. It comes back. Now. My mother. Verlene Tackett is 71 years old, and she is not a monster, and I'm going to have to work at this part, so bear with me. She worked 22 years at the courthouse in the assessor's office, and she can tell you what any house in this county sold for in 1998. She takes a casserole to every single family in her church within 12 hours of a death. And I mean everyone. And I mean within 12 hours. She irons pillowcases. She has a Rolodex on her kitchen counter, an actual one, and it has been the fastest way to find a phone number in this town for 30 years. And she has been, since March of 2015, the person in Adair County who sends flowers. The Stoddard boys, both of them, killed on 63 coming home from a ball game. Desi Marchbank, 94, who played the organ at First Christian until her hands went. The Bewley girls' wedding, baptisms, the new preacher's welcome, the hospital gift shop opening, 400 graveside services if it's been one. My mother's name on the card, my mother's arms getting hugged in the parking lot afterward. My mother getting stopped in the produce aisle by a woman saying, "Verlene, I don't know how you knew, but that was the exact right thing. And I have to put one more thing about her in here, because I've listened to myself tell this at the shop and I know how easy it is to make a woman into a shape." The day I opened, the 2nd of March, 2010, I got down there at 5 in the morning, and my mother was already on the sidewalk in a coat with a bucket of vinegar water and a stack of newspaper, doing the front window. It was 31 degrees. She'd been there since 4:30. She did that glass until you could not tell there was glass, and then she put her bucket in her trunk and drove home before the first customer came. And in 16 years, she has never one time mentioned it, and I only know how long she'd been there because a man at the bakery told me. That is the same woman. Both of those are the same woman, and if I could tell you how, I wouldn't have needed 11 days. My daddy is Garnet Tackett, 74, and he ran a maintainer for the county road department for 31 years. He can back a trailer down a lane in the dark and he cannot finish a sentence about a feeling. He does this thing where he says the first 3 words of something and then finds a job to do with his hands. I've watched him do it my whole life. I thought it was shyness. That was one of the things I had wrong. When Rudy asked me in February and I said yes, I wanted 40 people at the community building out at the fairgrounds, which the county rents for $340 a day, and pulled pork, and my own flowers, and to be home by 9. My mother had it up to 140 inside of 3 weeks. She did it the way water gets into a basement. Well, we can't not ask the Marchbanks. Well, if we ask them, we have to ask the whole Sunday school. Well, honey, the community building's got that smell. And then one Sunday, she had the Sutter House booked, which is a restored place out on the north edge with a wraparound porch and 140 chairs and a caterer's kitchen, and she set the brochure down on my kitchen table and put 2 fingers on it and slid it over. I said we couldn't afford that, and my mother put her hand flat on the brochure and said, "It's my gift. Don't you dare." I want to tell you exactly what that felt like, because if you picture me getting robbed in plain sight and smiling about it, you won't understand one thing that comes after. It felt like being taken care of. I'm 41 years old. I've paid my own way since I was 19. I have never asked that woman for $1, and one time in my life, my mother wanted to hand me something, so I said thank you. I said it twice. In January, she sat at my kitchen table with 4 contracts and a pad of little sticky arrows, and she said, "Sign where I put the flags, honey. They just want the bride's name on it." I'm paying, and I signed 4 contracts without reading them at my own kitchen table, next to my own mother. I have thought about that afternoon more than any other afternoon in this story. The first thing that went wrong was so small I nearly didn't take the call. Tuesday, the 9th of June, 11 days out. I'm at the bench doing a casket spray, and the phone rings, and it's the girl from the Sutter house. Very polite, very sorry to bother me, just calling on the balance. $4,200, due 10 days before the event. I told her there was a mix-up, that my mother had paid it in January. She said, real careful, that they had a deposit from January, $800, and an open balance of $4,200, and the contract had my name on it. Now here's what I did, and it's the most me thing in this whole story. I did not call my mother. I did not want the phone call where she cries, and then I apologize. I thought, my mother is 71. She got confused about what a deposit is. It's $4,200. I have got that. I will go get a cashier's check and pay it and never mention it, and in October, I'll laugh about it. So at 10:15 that Tuesday morning, I took my passbook out of the fireproof box under the bench, and I drove 4 blocks to the bank. I have had that account since the 12th of August, 2000. I was 15. I'd spent that summer washing buckets and hauling flats at a greenhouse out on the blacktop for $4 an hour. And my mother took me in on a Saturday morning, and we sat at a desk, and a man gave me a little blue book with my name typed in it. And both our names went on the account because I was a minor, and that's how it's done. 26 years I fed that book, 10% off every wedding. The whole check from anything I did on a Sunday. $600 the year I did the Marchbank reunion by myself. I'd walk it over on a Friday and hand the book across, and the teller would run it through the machine and hand it back stamped. And I'd sit in the van with the book open on my knee for a minute before I ever started the engine. The last line in that book was stamped in the summer of 2015, $26,412. I hadn't stamped it since because there wasn't anything to add. I'd bought the delivery van and put a roof on the shop, and the money quit going in. And I'd told myself the whole time that the 26 was sitting there being the down payment on a house, or a wedding, or the year I finally got sick. It was the only money in my life that had never had a job. Cheryl Lomax has worked that bank for 19 years, and her mother taught me in Sunday school, and she is the reason they still stamp a passbook for me at all, because they quit issuing them in 2009, and everything's on the computer now. She took the book and said what she always says, which is that she wishes they'd never gotten rid of them. Then she turned to her screen. And I watched her read her screen and then read it again, which is a thing you do not ever want to see somebody do about your money. She said, "Roxanne, honey, are you wanting savings or checking?" I said savings. She turned the monitor about 1/4 of an inch, not all the way, just enough to be kind about it. $412. I want to be honest about what happened in me right then, because it wasn't what I'd have guessed. I didn't get hot. I got very organized. It's the same thing that happens to me when a bride's mother calls at 6 in the morning about the wrong ribbon. Everything in my head lines up in a row and waits its turn. I looked at that number, and my first thought was not who. It was, I have got a spray to finish by noon. Then I sat down in the chair by her desk, and I said, "Can you print me everything?" Cheryl printed me everything. It took her 20 minutes, and it came to 31 pages, and she wouldn't let me pay for it. She put it in a manila envelope, and she said, "You take that out to your van, and you read it out there, not in here," which was the single kindest thing anybody did for me that whole month. I read it in the van in the bank lot with the windows down. It was not one big withdrawal. That's the part that took the longest to understand. There were 61 of them. 61 counter withdrawals, in person, at that branch, from March of 2015 to the 3rd of June of this year. $200, $410, $360. One for $850, steady as a light bill, and small enough that not one of them ever asked to be noticed. $18,600 over 11 years. And then, in the last 5 months, 4 more that were nothing like the others. $2,200 in January, $1,800 in March, $1,600 in April, $1,800 On the 3rd of June, $7,400, right off the top, in the exact rhythm of a wedding getting bigger. 18,600 and 7,400 is $26,000. 26,412. Take away 26,000 is 412. I ran that arithmetic 3 separate times in that parking lot. I've counted stems my whole life, and I don't trust a number I've only added up once. It came out the same all 3 times, and the 3rd time is when my hands finally caught up with the rest of me. Then I went back in, because I had one more question, and I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. I asked Cheryl how, not who, how. And Cheryl Lomax, who has known me since I was 6 years old, put both her hands flat on her desk and told me the thing I'd had backwards for 26 years. She said, "Roxanne, a joint account isn't 2 halves. It's 2 whole owners. Either name on that account owns all of the money in it. Not half, all of it. Either one of us could have walked in on any Tuesday of the last 26 years and taken every dollar, and the bank would not have called the other one, and would not have been allowed to, and it wouldn't have been stealing, because both of our names meant all of the money and never meant half of it." I asked about the book, the little blue book with the number in it. She said the book has been a courtesy since 2011. It's a receipt for the times you bring it in. It has never once been the account. So for 11 years I had been carrying around a stamped, printed, official-looking number in a fireproof box, and it wasn't a balance. It was a photograph of a balance, taken in the summer of 2015. I asked her if there was anything to be done about it, and she took a second before she answered me, and then she said no. Not a report, not a claim, not a form. She said there was exactly one thing I could do, and it was for tomorrow, not for yesterday. I couldn't take my mother off that account, because you can't remove an owner. What I could do was close it and open a new one with nobody's name on it but mine. I said I'd do that after the wedding. She said, "Do it after the wedding then," in the flat voice of a woman who thought I ought to do it that afternoon and wasn't going to say so twice. I drove back to the shop and I finished the spray for the Ellinger service by 11:40, and it was good work, and Zoe delivered it. And I sat down on the stool at the bench with 31 pages in my lap and started matching dates. Because here's the thing about my shop that you'd only know if you've been in the back of one. Every order that goes out of here has a duplicate. Carbon copy, yellow underneath, spiked on a hook by month, and I keep them for 7 years for the accountant, and I have never once thrown out a box of them, so I've got 16 years of them in the storeroom in banker's boxes labeled in marker. I pulled the box for 2015, and I sat down on the floor with the bank pages beside me. The first withdrawal on those 31 pages was the 14th of March, 2015. $410, cash, at the counter. The 14th of March, 2015, was a Saturday, and it was the day we buried my grandmother. I made her casket spray myself. Nobody asked me to, and nobody could have stopped me. I was in the shop at 4 that morning, and I used white stock and the last of the greenhouse larkspur, and I drove out to the home place in the dark and cut the blue bachelor buttons out of her own rose with a flashlight in my teeth, because she planted them every year and they aren't worth anything, and they don't last. That's why they had to be in it. And on the yellow copy in that box, in my own handwriting, in the column where the price goes, it says $410. And in the box underneath it, it says paid cash. And in the card line, in my handwriting, because my mother called it in and said the words to me over the telephone and I wrote them down, it says, "Mama from your Verline." I sat on the floor of my own storeroom and I did not cry, and I want to tell you why. Because it isn't because I'm tough, it's because I was still counting. There were 60 more of these. The Stoddard boys, October of 2017, 2 identical sprays, because there were 2 of them, and they were 19 and 21. $380 each. Paid cash on the 11th. A withdrawal for $760 on the 11th. Desi Marchbank, the organ lady, February of 2021. $440, and I did the pedalboard in white because her daughter asked for it, and it took me 6 hours. And I didn't charge for the hours because that's not a thing I've ever charged for. Paid cash. Withdrawal, $440, same morning. The Bewley girls' wedding. The preacher's welcome. Baby Ellinger. The nursing home at Christmas. 3 years running. 61 orders. 61 withdrawals. Same amount every single time, and every one of them within a day of the other. And every one of them from a bank 4 blocks from my shop, and every single one of them marked paid cash, and on 61 cards, in my handwriting, some version of the same thing. With love, Verlene and Garnet Tackett. Thinking of you all, Verlene. Anything at all, day or night, Verlene Tackett. That's the part I need you to sit with, because it's the part that took me 11 days to be able to say out loud, and I only ever said it once before I said it at that wedding. For 11 years, my mother called my shop, and I picked up the phone, and I wrote her name on a card in my own hand, and I made the arrangement with my own hands, and then she walked 4 blocks and took my money out of my account and walked it back and paid me with it. And then she stood at the head of the grave and got thanked. She didn't steal from me to buy anything. She bought being her mother. If you've ever found out that a kindness everybody in town knows about was actually coming out of you, and that you were the last one to find out, tell me in the comments, because I have never felt so stupid in a room by myself in my life. And if you're staying, subscribe now, because the next thing I did was go see a man I've stood beside at 200 gravesides, and he told me something that had been sitting in plain sight for 11 years. First, though, the photographs. Because the photographs are why any of this went anywhere. I photograph every piece before it leaves. Every one. I have since the 2nd year. And it's not for social media, and it's not for pride. It's because families ask. 6 months out, a year out, somebody calls up and says, I can't remember what was on my mother's casket, and I can look and tell them. White roses and blue bachelor buttons, and a piece of the fern from your own front bed. There's no other record of it anywhere on this earth. Flowers get thrown away 4 days later. The photograph on my computer is the only proof that thing ever existed. 11 years of my hands, filed by date. That Thursday, I made a list of the 61, and I went through and pulled them, and I drove them down to the drugstore on the corner and printed them at the kiosk. 4x6, 28 cents apiece. $20.44, including the tax. The girl running the register was somebody's granddaughter I couldn't place, and she looked at that stack coming out of the machine, and she said, Oh, those are so pretty. Is it for a scrapbook? I said, It's for a family thing. I took them back to the shop and I laid them out on the workbench in 6 rows, and I stood there and looked at 11 years of the best work I've ever done in my life. Every one of them built before daylight. Every one of them the only nice thing in somebody's worst week, and every one of them signed by somebody else in my own writing. That's when I quit being confused and got to be something else. Alden Ratliff has buried people in this county for 31 years. He is 63 and he wears the same gray suit, and he parks his own car across 2 spaces at every service so that a family can get in and out of theirs without standing in the rain. That's a small thing, and I've watched him do it 200 times. I went over Friday morning and I didn't tell him anything. I asked him a question. I asked if he'd have any record of who ordered flowers for his services going back to 15, and Alden took his glasses off and said, I've got a card on every service I've ever run. Because the state makes me keep some of it, and I keep the rest because a family's going to call me in 9 years and ask. Then he walked into his office and came back rolling a file drawer, and he put it on the table and left the room and shut the door, which is the most delicate thing a man has ever done for me. His records and mine matched. Of course they did. But there was something in his that wasn't in mine, and I hadn't thought to want it. Alden's cards note who the family thanked. It's not sentiment. It's business. He's the one who tells them who sent what, so they can write their notes. 61 times. The answer on his card is Verlene Tackett. When he came back in, I asked him the only question I actually had. I said, "Alden, did you think it was her?" And he sat down across from me, and he said, "Roxanne, I've stood in the back of 200 rooms with your mother telling a family she'd taken care of it. I figured it was the two of you. I figured you did the flowers and she did the money, and that's how y'all worked it." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. "I've been telling families for 11 years to be sure and thank Verlene." That's the sentence, right there. Not a thing my mother said, a thing everybody assumed for 11 years, because the story hung together perfectly. He told me one other thing before I left, and he wasn't gossiping. He was just laying it out flat the way he does. He said the Stoddard family had tried to pay me. Their aunt came in his office in 17 with a check for the 2 sprays, made out to my shop, and my mother happened to be there and told her the shop couldn't take it, that it was already handled, and that the family shouldn't dream of it. So it wasn't only that she let people thank her, it's that she stood between me and a check with my own shop's name on it. I said thank you, and I got out to my van before anything happened to my face. Now, here's where it stopped being a thing that had already happened. That afternoon, I stopped at Lynette Cordray's kitchen to drop off her boutonniere numbers. Lynette's 58, and she caters out of the old bank building, and she puts a paper towel under everything she hands you. She was doing my wedding. We've worked 80 jobs together, and she is one of maybe 4 people in this town who can tell when I'm not right. She looked at her clipboard and she said, "Now, your mother said we'd settle up Monday out of the cards. That's not how I generally do a thing, hun, but I said all right, because it's you. Out of the cards," I said. "Real easy? Remind me what the balance is?" $6,300. I sat in my van outside the old bank building and I made 4 phone calls in 20 minutes. And I want you to know I made them in my regular voice, the one I use when a delivery's late. The Sutter House, $4,200, due the 10th, unpaid. Lynette, $6,300, Monday. The rental people out of Macon, chairs and linens and the tent, $2,100, net 30. The photographer, $1,400, half down, balance the day of. $14,000. Every dollar of it on a contract with my name signed at the bottom, in my own hand, at my own kitchen table, next to a woman with a pad of little sticky arrows. And my mother's plan for it. I want to say this plainly, because for a while I tried to make it sound better than it is, and it doesn't get better. My mother's plan was the card box. 140 people at 11 o'clock on a Saturday? She had told at least 2 vendors in this town that the wedding would pay for itself out of the envelopes, and she had told them that in a voice that made it sound like an arrangement everybody had agreed to. That's why it had to be 140. It was never about the Sunday school class. She needed the room full because she needed the envelopes. 11 years of it was history. History's terrible, but it just sits there. The card box was Monday. I went home and told Rudy in the kitchen with the light off over the stove, and I'm going to skip most of what I said because I wasn't good that night. I'll tell you the 2 things that mattered. Rudy listened all the way to the end without one word. Then he said, "Okay, 2 questions. Do you still want to marry me Saturday?" I said yes. He said, "Then that's 1. Second one's just money, and money's slow." He's not a poetic man, and I'm not going to make him into one. What he actually meant was that we had a van, a shop, 4 months, and no children in the house but Piper, and that $14,000 is a horrible number, and it is not an emergency, and that the wedding was Saturday, and the bill was Monday, and those are 2 different days. Piper came through at about 11 to get a bowl of cereal, saw us sitting there in the dark, and said, "Is the wedding off?" Not upset, just checking, the way you'd ask if practice got moved. I said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Okay," and took her cereal and went. 14. They know more than they let on, and they need about 1 sentence. I did my crying that Thursday between 11:40 and midnight, standing at my own kitchen sink with the water running so it wouldn't carry, and then I quit, because I had a rehearsal dinner to build, and 41 arrangements to make, and a life. I'm not saying that to sound strong, I'm saying it because a woman who owns a shop in June does not have room to fall apart on a weekday, and there's a kind of mercy in that. The next morning I went out to my mother and daddy's on a Thursday at 9, because my mother gets her hair set on Thursday at 9 and has since Reagan. My daddy was in the shed with a mower deck up on blocks. I didn't take the papers in with me. I want that on the record. I didn't take one page out to that shed. I stood there and handed him a screwdriver twice, and then I said, "Daddy, how long have you known she takes money out of my account?" He didn't say what? He didn't say what account. He said the first 3 words of something, and then he found a job for his hands. He got the deck bolt started, and he ran it down, and he wiped his hands on the rag and put the rag in his back pocket and stood up. Then my father, who has never in 74 years finished a sentence about a feeling, told me the only story he's ever told me. My mother got married on the 22nd of June, 1974, in her aunt's front room in Novinger, in a dress her cousin wore first. She had 11 people, and my grandmother, her own mother, LaVaughn, who did the church flowers for 41 years, and who did funerals for anybody in the county who asked her, free. For 4 decades, my grandmother was 2 towns over that same Saturday doing the flowers for a wedding at Bethel, because she'd promised that family in February. She got to my mother's reception at 10 after 4 with the buckets still in the back of the truck, and the cake was cut. And she'd brought a coffee can of zinnias out of her own garden and set it on the table by the door. A coffee can of zinnias at her own daughter's wedding, my daddy said. She's been trying to be her mother since the day that woman died, and the good Lord did not give her the hands for it. He looked at the mower deck. "And you got the hands?" I asked him again, because he'd gone around it. He said, "I drove her. That's all he'd give me in the shed." I didn't get the rest of it out of him until Saturday, in front of everybody. And he gave it up then in one piece, and it cost him something to do it. I have to slow down here, because this is the spot where a story like mine goes wrong. That is a real thing that happened to my mother. She was 20, and her mother chose another family's Saturday over hers, and I believe that is the wound she has been packing gauze into for 52 years. I'm not going to pretend it isn't real just because of what she did with it. And it doesn't reach the 14th of March, 2015. It doesn't reach the Stoddard aunt with the check in her hand. Whatever a coffee can of zinnias did to a 20-year-old girl in 1974, it did not put her name on 61 cards I wrote myself. You can hold both of those. I've had a year to practice, and I can hold both of them now. Here's what I decided in the 11 days. And I decided it more or less all at once at that kitchen sink. I wasn't going to cancel. That wedding cost me $26,000, and it was already bought and paid for, and there was a man in my house who wanted to marry me on Saturday, and I was not going to hand my mother one more thing of mine. I wasn't going to call her. I know exactly how that call goes. It goes tears, then a story about her health, then a story about my health, then her sister on the phone by supper telling me I'd upset her. 41 years, I know the sequence. And if I called her Tuesday, then by Thursday there'd be a version of this in circulation that was already sanded down and set, and it would be the version that lasted. Here's the whole of what I did that week, and it's short. I never invited one extra person. I never asked a soul to be anywhere. I didn't tell Alden or Lynette or Cheryl anything. I didn't so much as change my voice on the telephone with my mother, and I talked to her 4 times that week about the seating and once about whether the mints were right. All I did was quit correcting the story. For 11 years, I'd been the one who smoothed it over when somebody said something at the post office. That week I stopped, and everything else my mother scheduled herself. And on the Wednesday, 3 days out, I had to go do it one more time. Ruby Bewley died on the Monday, 91 years old, and her granddaughter called my shop Tuesday morning, and there was never 1 second where I considered saying no. I did the casket piece in yellow because Ruby wore yellow to church for 60 years and everybody in that county knew it. Snapdragons and yellow spray roses and a little bit of the wild honeysuckle off my own fence line, which you can't buy and which lasts about 9 hours and which is exactly the smell of that woman's back porch. My mother called the shop at 8:15 Tuesday night, same as always. She said, Put me down for the standing piece for Ruby, honey, and you know what to write. And I stood at my own counter at 8:15 at night with a pen in my hand, and I wrote it. With love and prayers, Verlene and Garnet Tackett. I want to say something about that, because out of all of it, that's the one piece I'd take back. I could have said no on the telephone. I could have said the shop's not taking her orders anymore, and hung up, and let that be the first shot. I didn't, and the reason wasn't strategy and it wasn't nerve. It was Ruby Bewley. There was a family in this county putting a 91-year-old woman in the ground on Thursday, and whatever was happening between me and my mother, it was not going to happen on top of them. So Thursday morning, I stood at the back of the tent at the cemetery, the way I do, off to the side where the funeral home puts the flower people, and I watched Ruby's granddaughter cross that grass in the heat and take my mother's 2 hands in both of hers and say thank you. And my mother said what she says. She said, "It was nothing at all, sweetheart. Anything you need." 62. That one she didn't pay for, and she couldn't have, because there was $412 left in the world with her name on it. On the phone Tuesday night, she'd said, "Put it on my ticket, honey. We'll settle up after the wedding." And I'd said, "All right." And I'd written it on the yellow copy in my own handwriting, the way I've written everything else in this story. Balance due, $480. Settle up after the wedding. 2 people in this town heard my mother say some version of that sentence in June, and I was one of them, and Lynette Cordray was the other. I got in the van and I drove back to the shop and I finished a bridal bouquet, and that is when I quit having any question at all about Saturday. If you're still with me, subscribe before this next part, because everything up to here is a woman finding things out. The rest of it is 1 hour on the 20th of June, and I've only told it once. The morning of the 20th, I was in the cooler at 3. I did my own flowers. Of course I did my own flowers. 14 tables of white stock and larkspur, and greenery I cut myself off the fence line, and the blue bachelor buttons, 3 flats of them, out of my grandmother's rose at the home place, which I've kept going for 11 years now because somebody has to turn that ground. My own bouquet was stock and bachelor buttons and nothing else. Zoe tied it and used the wrong ribbon on purpose because she says I don't know what I look good in, and she was right, and I've got the picture. Piper did my hair, badly, at 7, and then Lynette's girl fixed it at 9 and told Piper it was perfect, which is why I'd hire that woman for anything. At 10, I put a paper sack in the van, 61 photographs, and the bank pages, and 13 yellow duplicates I'd taken off the spike, and the little blue book. I want to tell you what that room looked like at 11 o'clock, because it wasn't a wedding. It was a county. The Stoddards, both sides, 9 of them at table 4. Desi Marchbank's daughter, 72 years old, who drove up from Moberly. Pastor Ellinger, who my mother sat at table 1. Alden Ratliff in the back in the same gray suit with his wife. Lynette's people in and out the kitchen door. Cheryl Lomax from the bank at table 11. Zoe at the door handing out programs, in heels, holding a bucket she didn't need. 140 people, and I'd made the flowers for the worst day of about 40 of their lives. We got married at 11:15 on the porch, and it was the good part, and I'm not going to hand it over to the rest of this story. I'll tell you one thing about it. When Rudy put the ring on, he said, "There," like a man leveling a machine on a bad floor. Dinner was at 12:30, Lynette's ham. And at 10 after 1, my mother went up to the microphone, and she was happy, genuinely happy. She was in dusty blue, and she'd had her hair done twice that week, and she was the happiest I've seen that woman since 2015. She thanked everybody for coming. She thanked Pastor Ellinger. She said something nice about Rudy that I'll keep. And then she got to the part she'd been building to, and she put one hand out toward the room. I want everybody to look around at what her mother did for her. Not one flower in here came out of her pocket, and 140 people laughed and clapped. I stood up. I had my napkin in my left hand and the paper sack in my right, and my voice came out at the level I use at 4 in the morning when a bride's mother is crying on the phone about ribbon, which is the only voice I've got for a hard thing. I said, "Mama, that's true. And I want to explain it, because most of the people in this room have got a piece of it. Then I started laying photographs down the head table. I didn't hand them to anybody. I laid them face up in a line, and when I ran out of head table, I started on the family table, and Zoe, bless that child, 19 years old. Nobody told her anything. Zoe came up and started laying them out on 4 and 5 and 6. I said, "That's the spray for my grandmother, the 14th of March, 2015. I cut those blue ones out of her own garden with a flashlight at 4 in the morning. It cost $410, and my mother paid me in cash that same morning out of my own account at the bank, 4 blocks from my shop. I wrote the card. It says, 'From your Verlene.'" Nobody gasped. That's not what a room that size does. What it does is go quiet from the floor up, table by table, until the loudest thing in the building is the air handler. I said, "That's the Stoddard boys, both of them. 11th of October, 17, $760, cash, out of my account that morning." And a woman at table 4 picked up a photograph and turned it toward the light and said, "That's my boys." Not loud. She said it to the table, the way you'd say it to yourself. And that's the moment my mother lost the room, and I didn't do it. 9 people at table 4 did it, leaning in over a 4x6 photograph of a casket spray from 9 years ago that they'd have known anywhere on this earth. I put the bank pages down on the table, 31 of them, in order, with 61 lines highlighted in yellow because I'd sat up Wednesday night doing it. And I said the number out loud, because a number said out loud in a room does a thing that a number on a page can't. $18,600 over 11 years, 61 times, all cash. And 7,400 more since January, which is what was in this room, the chairs, the tent, Lynette's ham, my own flowers, that I made. $26,000, and there's 412 left. And there's one more from Thursday morning that I haven't got a photograph of, because I only printed these on Monday. That one's still on the ticket. My mother came at it the way I knew she would, and I'd braced for all 3, and it still went through me. First she cried, real crying, not for show. I've never in my life seen my mother fake a tear, and that's what makes her so hard to answer. She said she had carried this family, that nobody knew what she'd carried, that she'd been so tired. Then she went after my daddy. She said, "Your father handles the bank. He always has. Garnet, tell her." And then she got her feet under her and she straightened up. And she reached for the thing that has ended every argument in that family since before I was born. And what she reached for was her own mother's sentence. She looked down that long table at me and she said, "Somebody in this family has to be the one who sends flowers." And I said, "Somebody was, Mama. It was me. Every time. And I wrote your name on it in my own hand, because you asked me to." Then my daddy stood up, 74 years old, at a table full of ham, with his napkin still tucked in his collar. He didn't look at her, and he didn't look at me. He looked at the tablecloth. He said, "Every one of them, I drove her. She'd have me pull up in front and I'd sit with the truck running." And he sat down. That's it. That's the whole thing he'd been not saying for 11 years, and it took him 9 seconds. Alden Ratliff stood up in the back then, and I did not want him to, and I'm glad he did. He didn't say anything about my mother at all. He said, to the room, in his working voice, "For any family in here that's wondering every service I've run since 2015, the flowers came out of that shop, and Roxanne made them. And the reason y'all thanked Verlene is that I told you to. That's on me, and I'll be correcting it." My mother stood there in dusty blue, and she looked around for one person to be on her side. And I watched her go table to table with her eyes, and I don't believe I have ever been sorrier for anybody I was doing a thing to. Then she walked out onto the wraparound porch, and nobody went after her, and that was the worst part of the day. I picked my napkin back up and I said, "Y'all eat. There's plenty. We're going to cut the cake at 2. And we did. I want to be honest about the rest of it, because the honest version is smaller than what you'd want. Nothing happened to my mother. There was nothing to happen. Cheryl was right in every particular. My mother's name was on that account. The money was hers as much as it was mine, and there is no report to file, and no charge to bring, and no lawyer in this county who'd have taken $1 of mine to try. I asked one in July, and he was decent enough to tell me in 15 minutes for free. I closed the account on Monday the 22nd at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I opened a new one with my name on it and nobody else's, and I moved the $412 into it, and Cheryl printed me the signature card, and I read every line of it in the lobby before I signed. The bills got paid slow. The Sutter house took $400 a month, and never once made me feel like anything. The rental company out of Macon took the whole $2,100 right then, because I had it and I wanted it gone. The photographer, whose name is Kiara and who is 24 and shot the whole thing without knowing one thing about any of it, cut her balance in half, and I fought her about it and lost. And Lynette Cordray sent me an invoice for $6,300 with a line through it and a new number under it that was exactly her food cost, and at the bottom she wrote, "I've watched you feed this town for 16 years. Paper towels under it." I paid the food cost in October. The card box, since I know you're wondering we opened it on Sunday like anybody does. It was $4,000 and change, and every dollar of it went straight into the balances, and I'm not going to dress that up. My mother's plan worked a little. The difference is that everybody who put an envelope in that box that day knew exactly what it was going to, because they'd watched. 11 families sent me checks in July. I cashed 4 of them, from people I know can afford it, and I sent the rest back with a note. That was harder than it sounds, and I still don't know if I got it right. The photographs went home with people. That was not my plan. Table 4 took theirs before the cake, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, there were maybe 30 of them gone out of that room, and I've since heard of 2 on refrigerators and 1 in a frame in a house in Novinger. I printed a second set in August for the families who weren't there, and I mailed them with a card in my own handwriting that said what it was and didn't say one word about my mother. My mother and I have not fixed it. I'll say that flat, because I know what a person listening at this hour wants to hear. She wrote me a letter in September, 4 pages. It has some true things in it and 1 line about her own mother and the flowers at Bethel that made me put it down for a day. It does not have the words I took, or I'm sorry, anywhere in those 4 pages, and I've read it enough times to be sure. It's in the drawer under the register. I haven't answered it. I haven't thrown it away either, and I know exactly what that means, and I'm not in any hurry about it. My daddy comes to the shop on Thursdays now. He doesn't call first. He fixed the cooler door in August, which had been dragging for 2 years, and he brought his own hinge. We don't talk about it. He said his 9 seconds in front of that whole room, and I don't believe he's got another 9 in him, and I've decided that's all right, because he stood up when standing up was the only thing worth anything. He drives her to church. He should. She's 71. She goes to the 8:30 service now instead of the 11 o'clock. Nobody asked her to. In a town this size, that's the whole verdict, and it got handed down at the coffee pot, not in a courtroom. Now, the part I actually keep. In October, on a Saturday, Piper and I went out to the home place and dug my grandmother's dahlias and packed them in wood shavings in the same crate, because it's the same crate. Piper is 14, and she wanted to know why we don't just buy new ones, and I told her, and she said, "So this is the exact same flower as when you were little?" And I said, "More or less." And she thought about that the whole way home. We put in 40 feet of bachelor buttons for next year. They're not worth anything. They don't ship. They don't last. And my grandmother planted them every single year, and now so do I, and now so does that child. And there's one thing that changed in my shop, and it's small, and it's the only thing in this story I'd call a win. There's a pen on my counter now, and a stack of cards. And when somebody phones in an order and starts to tell me what to write, I say, "I'll hold it for you at the counter, and you write it." I lose an order about every other month over it. Somebody gets huffy about how they're 80 miles away, and they've always just told the girl what to put. And I say what I say, every time, which is that I'll make anything they want with my own 2 hands. but a person's name on a card ought to be in that person's own writing. I used to think the flowers were the gift, and the card was just how people signed for it. I know better now. The card was the gift the whole time. The flowers are only what somebody paid to have their name written on it. That's my story. 61 photographs, a little blue book that said $26,412 for 11 years after it quit being true, and $412 left in an account I started when I was 15 with greenhouse money. Here's what I'd ask you to do tonight, and it costs nothing, and it'll take you 10 minutes this week. If your name is on an account with anybody else's name on it, a parent, a grown child, a sister who got put on it when you had surgery, walk into that bank and ask them to print you the whole history. Not the balance, the history. And if what you've got at home is a passbook or a statement in a drawer, understand that it is a receipt for the day it was printed, and it is not the account. I carried mine in a fireproof box for 11 years like it was worth something. If you know a woman who does the work in her family and watches somebody else get thanked for it, the one who cooks it, sews it, drives it, sits up with it, send her this one. She'll know by the second minute whether it's hers. And tell me in the comments whose name was on the card in your family, and whose hands actually did it. I read them. That's all of it. Thank you for sitting with me on the porch tonight. I'll see you in the next one.